welcome back. This is the second unit on the coincide with the thorax, abdomen, and pelvis. For our purposes, I've just decided to look at the entire thoracic or cervical, thoracic, lumbar, vertebra, sacrum, all of it in one shot, and this will actually be looked at over several units. So, as we know, this is just a typical spine. We're looking anteriorly, if you're looking through the body. This is the posterior portion, inferior with the sacrum, superior where the skull would be. So, there are, just a basic overview, we have 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and then the fused vertebra of the sacrum. And while there are a lot of common features to all of these vertebrae, each of them has their own unique distinguishing marks. So we're going to look at these. We're also going to look at the ribs and sternum as well. So let's get started with some typical vertebral anatomy. Now the first part, a good way of looking at this, is to identify the vertebral body. It's this fairly large portion of bone, easy to identify first. And this is, again, the anterior portion, moving posteriorly. Okay. The next part that we'll look at is right here, that I'll wrap the probe around. And it's a little bony outcropping. See right there, is called the pedicle. Now, people often confuse the pedicle with the lamina. Basically, a good way of remembering that this is the pedicle is if you look at this from a superior view, you only see the only attachment point for this neural arch is the pedicles. Now, the root word of pedicle, ped meaning foot, I think of as, you're being grounded, as your feet attaching to the vertebral body. If you were to cut these off, all of a sudden, oops, it just separates entirely. So, pedicle, foot, attached to the ground being the vertebral body. So, hopefully that's a helpful way to remember it. Now, again, we start to go over more posterior. This thicker piece is called the lamina. It's all the way around. And then both lamina come to a point at the spinous process. Spinous processes are always going to be pointed downwards, never like that, just for reference. So now, as you can see, that bony structure between the lamina, the pedicle, lamina, the pedicle, attached to the vertebral body, forms a narrow opening, or a hollow opening. That hollow opening is called the vertebral foramen, okay? And that's again surrounded by this neural arch. Now if we want to look at this actually, look between these two vertebrae, for example. As soon as you have two vertebrae together, 2 or more, these vertebral foramen becomes a vertebral canal. And that's again where your spinal cord is going to go through, which we can see this metal rod is doing just that purpose through the vertebral canal. So, now we're going to look at 2 other little pieces here. Where the pedicle is, where this probe is sticking through this little notch, is called the inferior vertebral notch. And if there's an inferior one, there's bound to be a superior one, which is right here. Now, you can see right here is the inferior vertebral notch, superior vertebral notch. And these will actually, the inferior vertebral notch of one vertebral body will interact with the superior vertebral notch of another vertebral body to form another foramen, a hole. It's called the intervertebral foramen. And this is where the spinal nerves will actually exit. So imagine coming from the spinal cord here. Oops. Look at this. And you can see like right through there, that's where the spinal nerves come out. Okay. So we see this little protrusion here that's sticking up superiorly from between the lamina and a pedicle. If we look at it from a posterior view, you can see this surface, and that's called the superior articular process, because that will articulate with the inferior articular process of a corresponding vertebra. So it's similar to the superior inferior intervertebral or vertebral notch, where they form the intervertebral foramen. The superior and inferior articular processes will actually, we can look at it here again. So here's where an inferior articular process will be. There's where a superior articular process will be. Where this probe is sticking, they'll actually articulate as a joint. And that's what's called a facet joint. And the facet joints, you see there's going to be two of them right here. Between two bodies, you're going to have two adjacent vertebrae are going to have two facet joints. And they actually will, along with the intervertebral disc, which you see right here between the vertebral bodies, they comprise what's called a motion segment of the spinal column. That's what allows you to when you flex, extend, this is very good, and actually allows some rotation. That's what these joints assist with. So it's just kind of an additional insight. And again, we covered the intervertebral disc. So now we're going to look at one other thing before I move on. As you can see on this thoracic vertebra, transverse process is another feature of most all the vertebra, but you can see it just jutting out along all of these. Transverse, moving transversely. So now we'll move on to differences in vertebra. So we'll start off most superiorly, the cervical vertebra. There's 7 of these. And here are 2 examples of your cervical vertebra. If you look at these again, anterior, posterior, flip them around, right? There's 2 telltale features. One, that we can see better on this one, are these holes, these foramen, transverse foramina. Cervical vertebra are the only vertebra that have foramen in their transverse processes. And these actually allow the vertebral arteries to travel up into the brain. So that's why they're significant, obviously. Next one, I'll use this cervical vertebra. The common feature to all cervical vertebra is a bifid spinous process, meaning it's got a split right through the middle, so there's technically essentially 2 of them right here. Whereas you look at, say, a thoracic vertebra, it's not bifid. And traditionally, cervical vertebrae are smaller. You don't have as much weight to carry. 2 unique cervical vertebrae are the C1 and the C2 vertebra. C1 is also known as the Atlas bone. Atlas, because of the statue of Atlas, he's got the world on his shoulders, the globe, your head, Atlas. Okay. It doesn't have a spinous process. It's very circular, an anterior and a posterior arch. It's got these condyles that will actually, these articular processes that will articulate with the occipital condyles of the skull, which we'll see later. And that articulation is what's called the atlanto-occipital joint or the yes joint. So you can move your head up and down like you're saying yes. The next unique named vertebra is called it's a C2 vertebra called the axis bone. And now its prominent feature is this big process sticking up here called the dens. Now the dens, when we look at this is anteriorly, of course. We look up here and we see the dens will actually fit up into the opening, right where the C1, the axis, the Atlas vertebra is. And these will actually articulate. And this is called this joint is called the the Atlas bone, or axial, sorry. was going to say atlanto-occipital. The atlanto-axial joint, or the no joint, because you can move your head back and forth like that. So there's just some unique vertebrae. Next we'll move on down, looking at the thoracic vertebra. The thoracic vertebra, two of its distinguishing features are, one, it's got a really spiny, long, prominent spinous process you can see here, so much more so than, say, a lumbar vertebra. It really sticks out quite a bit. You can see it particularly right here. It looks like shark's fins or something. Also, on its transverse processes, you can see these little articular, or these little processes again. Now these are called costal facets. As we see the superior articular process, on the transverse process you have these little facets called the costal facets. They're called costal facets because they articulate with the ribs, costal ribs. And you can actually see where that's articulating right here. But we'll get to that in a minute. Finally, we look at the lumbar vertebra. Distinguishing features for these, they're just really big. So much more so than cervical especially. You can see the difference there. Thoracic. These are so huge basically because you have almost all your body weight, your axial load body weight is going to be directly over these vertebrae. They give out a lot as you get older. Let's say these massive vertebral bodies. Also, in comparison to the thoracic vertebra, you can see the difference. These spinous processes are pretty short, kind of stunted, rounded. You can see here for sure. For these spinous processes, the thoracic vertebra, very sharp, very long. Lumbar, kind of rounded off and stunted. So those are your vertebral types. We're now going to go to looking at the cervical, or sorry, the sacrum, not the cervical, other end. So we look at the sacrum. It's unique in its fact that they're technically vertebrae, they're just fused together. There's a few major parts to this. We're looking from an anterior perspective. First, we're going to look right here. Between the last lumbar vertebral body and the sacrum, there's going to be a little eminence right here, and a little protuberance, and this is called the sacral promontory. Okay? Now, on either side of the central part of the sacrum, we've got these wings, and literally that's what they're called in Latin, or ala. Those are the wings. If we continue down, we can see these foramina. These are the anterior sacral foramina, because we're on the anterior side. If you want to loop back around here, same foramina, but because we're looking at it from the posterior side, they're called posterior sacral foramina. And that's just important to know, depending on, again, on where you're looking from. When we call it something different. We also see at the very most distal part of the sacrum, this little opening is the sacral hiatus. Hiatus referring to opening. And then, as you can see with this metal bar is going through, comes out through the sacral hiatus. It's a hollow tube called the sacral canal. So, now that we've done the vertebral column and the sacrum, we're going to start to look at the ribs. So, I've got two ribs here. One that's attached to the thoracic vertebra, another that's free. So we're going to use both. Now, to get oriented properly, that's the way oriented properly, we're going to be looking at this curve right here. It's going to be the most posterior part. This is the one, as you can see, that's attached to the vertebra. And then again, this is more posterior. And you can see how it loops around. A way of telling also whether you're on the right side, you can tell, oh, this is posterior, this is anterior, but which one is superior and inferior. A way to figure this out is, if we look around here, you can see this little ridge underneath here. And the ridge is always going to be on the inferior side of the rib. It's never going to be up top here. And this little ridge is called the costal groove. There are actually some vessels that actually run along here. That's what's called the costal groove, so the groove of the ribs. Always going to be inferior. So now we'll move back and we're looking on the posterior section here. We've got the head of the rib. The head of the rib has articular processes, both a superior and an inferior, which we can see right here. Those articular processes are attached to the vertebral body. Next, we're going to move on down. We have the neck of the rib, and from the neck of the rib, we get to the angle right here. As you can tell, it's angular, easily enough. Now, back to the neck, we can see this other process. It looks like it could be a joint, and it is. This is another articular process. That's what it's called. We call this, technically, it's on the tubercle of the rib, but on the tubercle there is this process called this articular process. And that's the one that's actually going to articulate with the costal facet of the thoracic vertebra. So you have numerous articular processes, the two that belong with the head, the other one that belongs with the tubercle, and the articular process of the tubercle that's farther along the rib, articulates with the costal facet of the thoracic vertebra. The two superior and inferior articular processes on the head of the rib articulate with the vertebral body. And then again, it falls around the costal groove, all the way up to the anterior portion. Look at our friend here. And we got the sternum. That's a good side, right? Okay. So, we got some nasty teeth. So, on the sternum, we have three different segments. We have this part, most superior, is called the manubrium of the sternum. We move inferior to that, we have the body of the sternum. And finally, we have this little ending piece, most distal portion of the sternum, and that's called the xiphoid process, which you can feel right here. So we look back at the manubrium. A couple features worth mentioning. The first, this most superior portion where my probe is, this little dip is called the jugular notch. Okay. We move lateral to the jugular notch, and you have another little notch called the clavicular notch. There's two of them, and you can see it's where the clavicle will articulate. We move on inferior to that, and we have a little ridge here, and that's called the sternal angle. It's between the manubrium and the body of the sternum. And once again, on the body of the sternum, you can see where the ribs come across, and this cartilage will actually attach to the body of the sternum. Well, they attach at little ridges, and these little ridges are called the costal notches. So, jugular notch, clavicular notch, and the aptly named costal notch. That wraps up our second video. And again, as before, feel free to use self-check quizzes and ask your TAs and professors for help if you need it. Thank you.
Se ha formado la